possible routes of communication between India and the outside world were very and many. But when we look at the monks and the itinerant merchants moving from one place to another, they must have moved along a particular route. We have references to Baveru in the Sutta-nipata, which says that he moved from Pratisthana in the Deccan to Sravasti. So, on his journey, Baveru crossed the cities of Mandhata, that is ancient Maheshmati in western Madhya Pradesh. Then he passed on to Ujjaini. After that, Bidisha. Bidisha is near Bhopal. Tumain, or ancient name is Tumbavana. Then Kausambi, and finally he reached Sravasti. So, this was one of the routes which Baveru took while going to the north from the banks of the river Godavari. Then again we have the instance of Jivaka, the ancient physician who went to Taxila to study medicine. So, the journey of Jivaka from Bihar to Taxila also calls for some scrutiny, because he must have crossed a very arduous route while undertaking this journey. We have reference to Buddha during the later part of his life in the Mahaparinirvana Suttanta, that from Rajagriha he undertook his journey covering places like Pava and finally coming at Kushinagara, that is Kashia, and where he finally had his parinirvana. Thus, this sort of movements of people during the 6th century BC and later on gives rise to the understanding that in ancient India we had very strong networks of communication. Of course, the routes were hazardous, it was not very easy, but that there were long and short routes and many arterial routes is evident from the different examples given in the Buddhist literature in the first place and also in other literatures. The basic routes which are very important in the study of early India are three. One is the Uttarapatha, which is the northern trans-regional route. The second is the Dakshinapatha, and the third route relates to the maritime network and the Silk Route between the trading pattern of India and the Roman Empire. Now, coming to Uttarapatha, we find that Panini first uses this term Uttarapatha when he talks about things coming via Uttarapatha. So, the term used is Uttarapathena Ritam. So, getting things through Uttarapatha, and this was the usage which Panini had. Later on in the different Jataka stories, Uttarapatha is mentioned as a very important route and its arteries are also mentioned. We have a northern network of Uttarapatha and a southern network. Both starts from Lahore, but the northern network of Uttarapatha ends in Bihar and Bengal, comes to Tamrolipti, and the southern network comes to Rajagriha. In the Ashokan inscriptions, what we find is that though we do not have particularly this term Uttarapatha, but then the find spots of the Ashokan inscriptions, particularly his major rock edicts and the references in the second major rock edict and the seventh pillar edict, where we have he talks of planting of trees, digging of wells for people who were moving along this road, and these people were monks, merchants, political personalities, army, everything. And so, it was important that this royal road was well planted with trees so that people could get shade, and which means that it was a very active road. Strabo quoted Megasthenes and talks about the royal road during the time of the Mauryan period, which had also milestones. So, this kind of road was very much in practice during the period of the Mauryan rulers. In the later periods, what we find is that the term Uttarapatha gained different kind of connotations. So, the the main trans-regional route which started from the west of Indus and then ended in around Tamralipta, that route, though known as Uttarapatha, was having different kind of connotations for different personalities, and this is reflected in the inscriptions of the later period. We can start with the inscription of Kharavela, the ruler of the Mahameghavahana dynasty in Kalinga. His inscription is the famous Hathigumpha inscription, where he talks about defeating the ruler of Uttarapatha. Now, Kharavela was located in Kalinga. So, from Kalinga, his Uttarapatha was the northern region. So, it might be the middle Ganga plains. The inscription is not very well written, it's a little bit blurred, and so we cannot read all the lines. So, and ruler has not been identified, but that we definitely know that by Uttarapatha, the ruler of Uttarapatha, Kharavela meant somebody in the northern Ganga plains. In the Chalukyan epigraphs, we find that Pulakeshin II is said to have defeated Harsha, who is referred to as Shakalo Uttarapatheshwara, that is the Lord of northern India. Interestingly, in the Aihole inscription of Pulakeshin II, the famous Chalukya ruler, we have reference to the defeat of Harsha, but this term Uttarapatheshwara is not mentioned there. But in the later Chalukya epigraphs and the epigraphs of his feudatories, Harsha is given the epithet of Uttarapatheshwara. But ironically, when Bana, writing his Harsha Charita, he talks of Uttarapatha, then Harsha's territory is not included in it. When he talks of Uttarapatha, he talks of the region which were to the west of Harsha's territory, because we know that Rajyavardhan was killed in the battle with the Hunas, and the Hunas are referred to as being part of Uttarapatha. Thus, we have polyvalent perceptions of the term Uttarapatha in different inscriptions. Kashmir was sometimes included as a part of Uttarapatha in Rajan Tarangini, and sometimes it was not inside the Uttarapatha. In a 9th century epigraph from Bengal, the inscription is Ghoshrava inscription. A monk Veeradeva, he is a very important scholar also, is said to have come from Nagrahara. Nagrahara is located in the present Jalalabad district of Pakistan, and it is said that that region belonged to Uttarapatha. So, Veeradeva came from Nagrahara to Bodh Gaya and finally to Nalanda, and therefore his journey was referred to as made through the Uttarapatha. Thus, in the 9th century, during the time of the Palas, the perception of Uttarapatha was mainly the Gandhara region in present day Pakistan. What is interesting is that with the literary image of Uttarapatha, we also have the archaeological correlates. The archaeological correlates talks about the commodities that were moving along that axis, and for the first time we have the painted grey ware. This kind of potteries were moving throughout all the centers of Uttarapatha, and we find that it was a cultural zone, a zone of material culture. Then again we have the circulation of numismatics, that is coins, along the axis of Uttarapatha. In the 6th century BC and following that period, Panchmark coins were excavated or found in hoards in different archaeological sites along the Uttarapatha, and so the coins can be taken as an archaeological correlate of the axis of Uttarapatha. Apart from the coins, we have different kinds of artifacts in the form of beads, in the form of tools, and these ceramics, and these all formed a part of the Grand Trunk Road, which was known in Indian history as Uttarapatha. Thus, the literary image of Uttarapatha was very clear, and along with the literary image, we have a very clear archaeological correlate in relation to Uttarapatha. The situation was a little different in case of Dakshinapatha. Again we take the instance of Bavari, and there we find that Bavari was located in Dakshinapatha, that is in the banks of the river Godavari. He had an hermitage in the banks of the river Godavari, and from Dakshinapatha he was actually moving, when he went to Sravasti, he was moving to the northern part. The literary image of Dakshinapatha is not very clear and sometimes quite ambiguous in the representations in epico-Puranic literature or in other Buddhist texts. When they are talking of Dakshinapatha, it talks about a road, about a region which has Pratishthan as the core. So, it was mainly centered around the area which was beyond the Vindhyas, beyond the Narmada. The cultural identification of Dakshinapatha was also varied. At one point of time, we have the feeling in the description of Dakshinapatha with regard to the journey of Agastya that the Aryan element was crossing the Vindhyas and was moving into the non-Aryan fold. So, this was one side of the picture. On the other hand, we find that the very non-Aryan elements like the concept of pygmies, the concept of Rakshasas are very much prevalent in the description of Dakshinapatha. Even when Rama's exile is being described in the Ramayana, we find that the places which he visited during his journey is not correctly identified. Thus, the picture remains a little vague in contrast to the places which we have in Uttarapatha. Dakshinapatha as a territorial unit finds its presence also in inscriptions, and we can think of the famous Nanaghat inscription of Nayanika, where you have the king of the Satavahanas, Simukha, being represented as Dakshinapathapati. The Satavahana inscriptions are also important in understanding the location of Dakshinapatha. The famous Nasik Prashasti of Gautami Balasri, when she talks about the achievements of Gautamiputra Shatakarni, her son, it is said that he was the lord of certain mountains, and these mountains are the Sahyadri, the Mahendra and the other mountains of the eastern Ghats and the western Ghats, and he is referred to as the lord and the pati of those mountains, and similarly he is also mentioned as Dakshinapathapati. In the inscription of Rudradaman, in the Junagadh inscription, we find that Rudradaman is said to have defeated the lord of the Dakshinapatha. So, by Dakshinapatha, the image that we get in the post-Mauryan period was that of the Deccan area, that is, which is from the west Konkan coast to the Andhra Kalinga coast. So, it was an orientation which was east and west axis. But if we look at the territoriality of Dakshinapatha in later period, or even in the earlier period in the time of Janapadas, when you have the division of the traditional divisions of the Indian subcontinent, the term Dakshinapatha meant certain territories which were in Deccan and also in further south. So, we have the inclusion of the Cheras, the Cholas, the Pandyas and the regions of the Deccan within the territorial limit of Dakshinapatha. The image that we get from the literature and the inscriptions of Dakshinapatha suggests that it is the area where we have the mingling of the Sanskrit based culture with the autochthonous element of the Deccan. In case of Arthashastra, we find that the idea of Dakshinapatha as a trade route comes in the form of bringing of precious stones or different kinds of ivories or as a resource bearing zone. So, Dakshinapatha was looked upon as a very important revenue extracting area, a very important resource bearing zone in the Arthashastra. And this is also evident from Ashokan inscriptions. Thus, the image of Dakshinapatha is filled with perceptions which talks about a cultural barrier between the north and the south, and also sometimes considers this cultural barrier as a very important element of the understanding of the south. When we read Pliny, we find that in his Naturalis Historia, Pliny divides 4 segments of the maritime route, which started from the Red Sea area. And in the 4 segments, he talks about the first port, which was in the Indus, and the name of the port is Patalini. So, from Patalini, the second segment is on the middle of the mouth of the Indus, which was the famous port of Barbaricon or Barbaricum, as mentioned in the Periplus. The third important port of call was Jaigar or Sigurdis, and from Jaigar it was the final port of call, which was Muziris or Muchiri. So, Muziris, as a very important port of the Indo-Roman trade, flourished for a very long time. It is important to note that recent excavations have tried to identify Muziris with a place called Pattanam. Now, during the time of the Roman trade, it has been seen that the 4 segments which has been talked about by Pliny was not always there. We find that when the Red Sea lane becomes very important, so it is the Malabar coast which thrives, and after this whole coastal trade network, we have regular movement from the port of Berenike or Myos Hormuz in the Red Sea to the ports of Muziris in the Malabar coast. With the discovery of the monsoon winds, the route from Myos Hormuz or Berenike in the Red Sea to the Malabar coast became very short, and a ship could ply within 40 days between these 2 places. Thus, trade network between the 2 ports became very active. But that does not mean that the Indus ports lost all its importance. What is interesting in this regard is that when you find the Malabar ports important, then it is the Red Sea lane which is very active. But when the Indus ports are important, it is the Persian Gulf which is very active. Pepper was used as a spice, as a condiment in the Roman world, and Muziris was famous as a zone for producing paper. Pepper was known to the people of India as Yavana Priya. The term Yavana denoted the Greco-Roman period, Greco-Roman people. The other commodities that were very important in this whole entire trade network was nard, of which you have mention of spikenard, Gangetic nard, and it is a kind of a grass that was grown in the lower foothills of the Himalayas, and then it is useful as a spice and it has a medicinal value. So, pepper, nard, and then of course textile. Textile is a very important part of this entire trade network, and what we have to remember that it was not only the luxurious textile items like the muslin, because we have reference in a loan contract document to the Gangetic muslin, but in Berenike loads of normal cloth has been found which were shipped from the Indian coast. So, textile was a very important item of trade, and we have to keep in mind that it was a bulk trading item during this period. with the coming of the Kushanas, we find that the whole political structure of northwest India underwent a change. The Kushanas became powerful in Afghanistan, part of Central Asia and India, and then they tried to control the trade that was going on from China to the ports of Antioch and Alexandria. The whole route is known as the Silk Route because silk was the most important item of export or movement in this route. Regarding the Silk Route, we find that it starts from Central Asia, crosses the Taklamakan Desert, and then the final point is the markets of Alexandria and Antioch. But while coming from Dunhuang in China, we find that there are bifurcations. We have the Taklamakan Desert, and around the Taklamakan Desert, the Silk Route bifurcates into two, the northern Silk Route and the southern Silk Route, and the two routes finally merges in a place called Kashgar. Kashgar is a very important point for the merchants. We have different stories, both anthropological and historical, which talks about the importance of Kashgar. So, Kashgar was the melting pot, and from Kashgar the movement of the caravaniers, of the merchants were along the areas of Central Asia. They crossed Parthia, and here comes the political importance because originally this area was under the Parthians, later on it was taken over by the Kushans, and then so the Kushans being a power which were pro trade, they allowed the merchants to move into the marts of Palmyra, and from there it went to the emporiums of Antioch and Alexandria. The archaeology also supports the entire network of coastal trade because we have a kind of a ware which is known as rouletted ware, which has been found in all the ports along the coast, particularly in the east coast and also in countries of Southeast Asia, which implies a long maritime or coastal network along the east coast to Southeast Asia. Thus, what we find that when during the time of the Kushanas there was political unification of the entire northwest India, it was very congenial for the traders to move from one place to other, and so it created an atmosphere which fostered long distance trade, and along with the discovery of the monsoon wind, it expedited, and therefore we have the far-flung trade network with the India and the countries of the Roman Empire. Thus, if we look at the entire scenario, what we find is that the Uttarapatha controlled the entire network of the northern trade route. The Dakshinapatha actually meant the trade route which was active in the Deccan. It does not give us a very clear idea of the far south. And regarding the Indo-Roman trade networks, we have two active sea lanes. One was the Persian Gulf, where you have the ports of the Konkan being very active. The other sea lane was the Red Sea, where you have the Malabar coast as a very active zone, and particularly the port of call Maziris becomes very active. And regarding the Silk Road, we have the continuous history of the Silk Road right from the pre-Kushana times till the later period, where silk as an important item of transshipment was plying through this route. But apart from silk, we have the important and very interesting ritual items of Buddhism. For example, the different kinds of stones that were being used for Buddhist rituals, which plied along the Silk Route in all the ages.